Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing isn't
So some
there,
readers love that, and some readers are like, but I wanted more of this. So it's kind of a gamble.
Hello and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by critically acclaimed novelist, illustrator, and playwright Edward Carey. Hello, welcome.
Hello, Jamie. Thank you very much for having me.
Great to have you on. Let's jump right in with the new novel coming out 9th of October. It's called Edith Holler. Tell us a little bit about it.
So it is set in Norwich in 1901, just after the death of Queen Victoria, and it's about a theatre in which there is a child who's been cursed, and she's told she's not allowed to ever leave the theatre. And whether this curse is true or not, we don't quite know. That her father is an actor manager who obviously runs the theatre, but he gets great audiences for his theatre because of this child who's not allowed to leave the theatre, and she walks around the audience dressed in grey, and she's not allowed to speak to them. And it's the story of this child, and it's about how older generations can repress younger generations. But it's a love letter to the city of Norwich and to theatre as well. I wrote this during the pandemic, and I was sitting in Austin, Texas, very far away from home. I was born in Norfolk, and I was sort of longing to get back home. And of course, all the theatres in all the world were dark. There was no theatre going during the pandemic, of course. And I was just sort of combining two loves, really.
Okay, that's nice. It's kind of trying to put your foot back in memories and back kind of where you came from.
Right.
That your description of it as a sort of story of generations reminds me of that. I don't know if you've ever seen the phrase tradition is just peer pressure from dead people.
I love it.
Your novels are always set across a variety of time periods and historical events. What was it about this specific time period? It's 1901, right? And like setting it around a theatre. What was it that kind of drew you into that specific thing?
I wanted to some extent to really think about England and home. I live in America now. I have done for a long time, but I will always be English wherever I happen to live. But I deliberately wanted to set it just after Queen Victoria had died. The theatre right at the beginning is all covered in mourning crepe. And I was thinking about, then Britain must have been questioning itself. What are we? We've lost this huge archetypal figure. Who are we now? And I was actually, I was really thinking of Brexit, which I detest, and thinking of the harm it's done. And I thought this was a way of actually, in sort of through camouflage, of looking at Englishness, and I use a lot of folklore in the novel from East Anglia, and I grew up there, as I said, and had all these stories in my head since I was a child. And so it was about identity. It was about Queen Elizabeth II was still alive, but she was she was very old. I knew obviously she wasn't going to last forever. None of us do, alas. But so that thought of change and of uncertainty, of going forward and not quite knowing who we are anymore.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the timeline was for the Queen's death, because obviously that would seem very poignant as an inspiration for setting it just as Queen Victoria died.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that, and I do remember, obviously it was very recently, but when Queen Elizabeth II died, I was in Austin, Texas, and it was just like, oh my God, could that even happen? It seemed like it was never going to happen somehow.
Yeah, it's bizarre because it's, for probably most people in the UK, there has been no other monarch. And it's weird when like institutions change like that. Like they've literally changed the money, they've changed the national anthem is different. Like anything that was Her Majesty's something or something is now His Majesty's.
And so you feel uncertain that
it's kind of
everything
weird.
that you'd had as a sort of, very solid part of your life is no longer there, whether you're a royalist or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was talking about James Bond the other day with a friend of mine, and we were suddenly both aware that it was now His Majesty's Secret Service and not Her Majesty's Secret Service, which I thought was a strange one.
Yeah.
Getting back onto you, historical fiction. This is obviously historical fiction, but also your other novels are kind of steeped in historical fiction. It always comes with, as a genre, it comes with a lot of research. What does that kind of part of the process look like for you?
Well, this was a way of, for this novel, for Edith Hollar, this was a way of traveling when we weren't allowed to travel. And so it was a way of going home. And I kept thinking of the book by Xavier de Maistre, A Voyage Around My Room, which I don't know if you know his work, but he was a soldier and he was placed under house arrest. And so he wrote a sort of guidebook to the room he was imprisoned in. And I think we were all rather doing sort of versions of that during the pandemic. And so this was, I steeped myself in Norwich history. And of course you could use eBay or whatever, books could be delivered to you. And so I just got lost. I couldn't go there. I was longing to go there, and it discovered new things about my home city. And it was a joy of discovery. And in the novel, the narrator is Edith Hollar, this 12-year-old girl, and she can't travel. As I said, she's stuck inside the theatre. And so she eats Norwich basically to keep herself going. She goes up to the roof of the theatre and looks across at the city and is inspired by it, loves it, has never set foot in it, but is actually a real expert in it. So we were having the character was having a similar experience as I was discovering more about the city. And in the novel, Edith discovers this terrible secret about the city. But I also, it was all using theatres and there's so much theatre in it, and I did some research into theatre, but I'd worked in different theatres, for many years in Romania and Lithuania, and with a shadow puppet master in Malaysia. But most of all, I was a stage door keeper of the Comedy Theatre, now the Pinter Theatre, on Panton Street in London. And I used to bike in the morning with the keys to the theatre and unlock it, the old Victorian theatre. And it was like, this is my theatre. Nobody else is here. It's mine. And I used to go and stand on the stage when nobody else was in the theatre. And I would lock it up, the whole theatre, at night. And the sounds inside were so strange in that sort of empty cavern. Nobody else is there. And the sounds were distorted from people walking by, coming out the street, or screaming out of pubs or whatever. And so I kept that research was sort of lived research, but I used that in the book. But in other books, there was one novel that I've written called Little that took me 15 years to write, which is ridiculous. And that was based on the life of Madame Tussaud, and she lived very dramatically through the French Revolution, and so I had to do tons and tons of research for that, and I got very bogged down in it, and I had to sort of leave the novel behind because I think the research had started to eat me rather than me eating it, and I couldn't focus on the story. There was too much stuff. You can't read every book on the French Revolution. You're not alive long enough. And so it was actually stepping away from the research and remembering, actually what I really wanted to tell, what the story really was. Once I could get back to that, then I could make the novel work. I was very lucky to visit the novelist John Fowles when he was still alive, and in Lyme Regis, and I would go and see him, and he said his piece of advice was write the book, then do the research, which is an exaggeration. But as he was saying, it was amazing to meet him. But this was his way of saying, keep your eye on the story. Remember what it is that you're trying to say.
That makes sense. So doing something which was based on the place that you came from and also set around theatres, which you've had like lots of experience with, even though it was set in 1901, there was a lot of frame of reference that you already could like pull on from your past. Was that a conscious decision in terms of picking a place and a setting after doing Little, which was obviously a very broad topic, which I imagine you had less experience with?
Yes, it was. I wanted, and I missed theatre as well enormously during the pandemic. And I really I've always wanted to write a novel set in the theatre. And so this seemed like to be the time, and rather like a camel with a hump. I had all that experience in the theatre before, and I could use that. Quite a few years ago now, I worked in a theatre in Romania in a city called Craiova, and I lived inside the theatre while we were rehearsing it. And as an experience was very strange, because you'd have you'd get out of your room and you were there already in the theatre, and the actors, there were many actors who had almost no money. They were living in dressing rooms, and it was not a beautiful theatre by any means. It was this awful Ceausescu era monstrosity. But I do remember just walking around the theatre, and it felt like if you never left it, that house of dreams seemed to sort of enter into you, and you were quite confused as to what was reality and what wasn't.
Yeah, like you say, it sounds like, there's a lot of lived experience in this, which must have cut down a lot on the research. When talking about Little, and that was the French Revolution, Madame Tussauds, would you ever take on a sort of project that size in terms of research again, or has that kind of made you assess things more acutely before you jump into them?
So, if I was to go back and write another big historical novel, I think I would. I mean, I feel like I'm gearing up to get ready, and there's a particular subject that I might focus around it. The process of research is a lot of fun, and I feel like though each time I start a novel, I go, how do you write a novel? I've completely forgotten. And I feel like that every single time, it's as if you have to learn again every single time. But I think in the question of research, I feel like I did learn something from that last time, and it's to keep your eye on the story, on the characters, and let them lead you through the story, and not to get drowned in the research. And I think actually writing about Madame Tussauds, what gave me confidence in going back to it is in her own autobiography, she lies terribly. I mean, all the time. She gives you these extraordinary, bombastic reports of her existence, which aren't true. So I thought, well, if she can lie, I can lie too. And in America, they don't do it so much here, but in America, they always say such and such a novel on the cover, as if they're warning you that it's full of lies. And so I felt I had a certain freedom in the end, and that freedom gave me just let me write the story as I wanted to write it.
Yeah, the artistic license, I guess.
Yeah.
And you
Stop by O'Reilly Auto Parts for the power, performance, and reliability of a new Super Start battery. Visit O'ReillyAuto.com.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Also, alongside the writing, you are also an illustrator. Did those two things always come hand in hand for you, or did one come first and the other followed?
David, always together, always, right from the start. Even when I was a kid, if I was writing stories, I would always draw the characters too. It's my way of getting to know the character. If I can't see the character, if I can't physically understand them, I feel I don't know them.
Okay.
And so it's also ways I'm drawing the characters, I'm thinking about the writing, and the drawing makes me think of things that I wouldn't have otherwise considered about the characters and how they would interact with each other and with their world. And so it's it's absolutely, I can't do one without the other. And I do both in tandem whenever I'm doing a book. There's always a certain amount of one and then the other. And writers are always looking for ways to not write. And this is one of my ways of doing it, is to draw and pretend that I'm working on a project while I'm at it.
Okay, that's really interesting. So are there a lot more drawings and sketches that get done that don't end up in the final
yes,
copy?
Absolutely. And sculptures and, all sorts of different things. So I do notebooks and I draw all over the notebooks. I've made small busts of the principal characters for Edith Holler, just so I felt like I could understand them. And so that was part of the process. And at home, back in Austin, I have, I carved a wooden woman who's 4'3" or 4 tall, which was the exact height of Madame Tussaud. She was very small. And she's fully articulated, this wooden doll. You can move her arms and legs. And my wife had a haircut so that she could have some hair. And she sits with us at home. And that was also part of the process. And for Little, I also, I made a wax death mask of one of the principal characters because I needed to understand how to work in wax.
Right.
That I needed to fully understand her profession, and also actually doing it. One of the things that I hadn't properly realized, of course, is smell is a major part of it. The smell of the wax, and so then I felt I could put in the writing, that process of making wax figures, of putting in hairs, etc., etc. So that was, it becomes an obsession, and I think you have to be obsessed with your work. You need to have a close relationship with your material, and with Edith Holler, the illustrations are all of a Victorian toy theatre. Those card theatres that you can cut out and you put in different backdrops and push your characters back and forwards across the card stage, so that you could actually cut the novel out and make the card theatre. Or you could just go to my website and download it and not cut the novel out. But that was the other thing, that just as the pandemic was starting, the last bit of human interaction before I fled back to Austin, and my family was sitting in a cafe just by the British Museum, talking with a great illustrator, Clive Hicks Jenkins, and we talked about Victorian toy theatres as the world was beginning to close down, and I sort of fed on that last conversation for months and months and months, and I knew that then when I was going to illustrate this book, that I would do it as a Victorian toy theatre. And the first illustration that I did of it, even before I'd written her voice fully, was a card theatre illustration of Edith Holler, the character herself.
Oh, okay. That's so interesting that you're kind of creating all these different pieces of art in different mediums whilst you're writing. When it comes to actually like the story itself, then, do you have it planned out, or are you just kind of doing all of these different creations whilst the narrative is kind of figuring its own path?
I'm not a huge planner because I want to be surprised by what happens, but I need to have some sort of structure to understand what's going on. And with Edith Holler, I knew right from the beginning it would be in 5 parts. It would have a 5-act structure like Shakespeare. I was very certain that, and that the final act, Edith in the end writes a play about what she's discovered about Norwich, and the final act is basically the play on stage, with all sorts of things going wrong, but pushed right at the end. So sometimes I have an idea. I wrote a trilogy set in a sort of slantwise Victorian London, and I knew that the final part of the trilogy would be in the Houses of Parliament as the Queen Victoria again came to open Parliament. And I knew that all of my characters would come then, but even as I was writing it, I didn't know which characters were going to survive this event.
Okay.
And so it was, I got to get them there, and then we'll see what happens. But I knew that writing the first book, so years before I would actually get to Parliament, right at the end. So and that's about as much planning as I do. What happens in between, I want to have some sort of experiment. And even when I get to the end, I don't know necessarily what's going to happen. But with something like Madame Tussaud, that is, it's already, decided, because she was a real person.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so it sounds like your plan is essentially, where it starts, where it ends, and then everything in between is discovered as you go. Yes,
but also I'm open to be surprised by the end, and I don't try to stick with exactly what happens. I want to, so much of writing is about improvisation, and it's about you need to surprise the reader, but you need to surprise yourself as you're writing to keep it alive. I'm always surprised by those authors who plan everything, to such detail, but it's what works for you, So
exactly.
I love the fact there are no rules in writing, but except for what works. That's the rule.
Yeah, what works for you. Like any if anyone ever talks about like a rule or anything in terms of the craft, I always think of it, they're much more like guidelines that you could try and see if that works for you.
No, I think that's right. And I think you work it out, but also, what works for you at one stage of your life may not continue being that. And I think you have to keep reassessing the way you do things and actually open up to trying things in a different way, because I think otherwise we can get stuck in a sort of repetitive pattern. And I think actually breaking that can be very liberating as well.
Yeah, always evolving, always learning something new from the last thing that you wrote or whatever. I guess it's the same with most creative disciplines, right?
Right.
Before we head over to the desert island, I did want to ask, your novels are all historically based and set. Would you ever, or have you ever thought about writing something with a contemporary setting?
My first novel is set sort of, they're old and somewhat eccentric people, but set in an unnamed city, which is sort of contemporary. And my second novel is set in a city that doesn't exist. It's a sort of 24-hour-a-day guidebook to this place that doesn't exist, which includes if you go to cafes holding the book in that city, you can get a 20% reduction in costs and things like that. But that city was sort of destroyed by an earthquake, and it's a modern city. But I'm not very. Having said that, I'm not terribly good at modern stuff. As was shown when I tried to connect with you to get onto this podcast. I love going back into history, and as I've said, I live in Texas, and I'm not a Texan, and I can't write about Texas, I feel, because it's not my material. But then at the same time, I'm not sure if I could really write about England now, because I haven't lived in it. I'm back, 2 or 3 times a year, but I don't live here. And so actually stepping back in the past, then I find I'm in a place where I can write, where I can feel free to write.
Yeah, and you have the resources that you have access to lots of different books or whatever it might be to reference things that did happen.
Yeah, and one of the books that I go back to again and again, not just for specific research, but actually just for the pure joy of it, is London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, in which he interviewed the poor of London doing various different jobs, including working in sewers, or there's an amazing interview with a man who made glass eyes for dolls. But suddenly London comes amazingly alive in those interviews that he did. And the voices are all so separate and real, and very exciting. And actually, when you read Mayhew, you understand that perhaps Dickens didn't exaggerate quite as much as you might have thought.
Okay, so it sounds like you are very much comfortable and happy within the historical space, and it doesn't look like contemporaries on the cards for you.
It might. Never say never.
Never.
I'm trying to work on something at the moment, and that might be more contemporary. But I just think, if I open a novel, which is terrible prejudice, if I open a novel and it's got something like a mobile phone in it, that seems dispiriting to me.
I understand, yeah. And mobile phones, it's an entirely different discussion, but mobile phones cause a whole host of problems for writers in terms of like tension and drama and things like that.
Right.
But yeah, that's an entirely different discussion. We are at the point of the episode where we head over to the desert island, and I will ask you, Edward, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book do you hope that it would be?
Well, I thought about this, and I had an immediate answer. And I thought, oh gosh, that's so obvious. But I can't come up with anything better. And I think I would be very happy to have the complete works of Shakespeare, I'm afraid.
That's great.
And I'm sure many of your interviewees have probably said the same thing. But during the pandemic, I read Shakespeare an awful lot, and there's a lot of Shakespeare references in Edith Hollar, and they're mounting a production of Titus Andronicus in the background of the play. And I just think that there's still, I go back and read King Lear, which is my favorite play, again and again and again and again, and I keep finding, of course, there's new stuff that I hadn't seen before. And so, that would be a big fat book, and you could just get lost in his world. It always seems that, one of the wonderful things about theatre is you can just pick up dead people, who've been dead for a long time, like Richard III or Henry V or people like that, and put them on stage and they're alive again. And I think, if you sat there on your desert island and you could sing, call out, blow winds and crack your cheeks or something like that, it might help. Yeah.
And it's been picked before, definitely on the podcast, but not as much as you would think, actually. Not as much as Jane Austen.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I'm afraid she gets a lot more play.
Right. Yeah, that wouldn't help me on a desert island, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. Next up, we are going to chat about breaking into publishing, literary agents, and if and how things change after publishing several novels. And that will all be in the extended episode available on Patreon.
Don't ever let anything else persuade you away from that.
Yeah, that's great. What a great way to round things off there. Thank you so much, Edward, for coming on the podcast and telling us all about your latest novel, Edith Hollar, and your experiences in writing and publishing and everything that you've kind of gone through on your publishing journey. It's been really, really cool chatting with you.
Thank you, Jamie. This has been an absolute pleasure.
And for anyone wanting to keep up with what Edward is doing, you can follow him on Twitter at EdwardCarey70 or on Instagram at EdwardCareyAuthor, or you can head over to his website, edwardcareyauthor.com. To support this podcast, like, follow and subscribe. Head over to the Patreon for all the extra stuff over there, and check out my other podcast, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again, Edward, and thanks to everyone listening. We will catch you on the next episode.